Hey Cooper 6, we're going to start off our ecology unit with a set of benchmarks on populations and communities and interactions between organisms. This is the first benchmark on populations and communities. So let's start off with a definition of what ecology actually is. Ecology is the study of populations and communities and their interaction within the environment. Right, so what are living things doing in their environment? First of all, we have to talk about what a living thing is. All right, we call any living thing an organism. Right, and that goes for plants and animals and bacteria and fungi. Right, but all of these things must be able to do three key functions in order to be considered alive. So in order for it to be considered an organism, it must be able to grow, it must be able to use energy, and it must be able to make more of itself or reproduce. I don't know if you remember this demonstration from way back in the beginning of the school year, but I took some rubber cement or glue and put it in a petri dish with water, and the thing started spinning around and moving about, and I tried to have this discussion with you about what it meant to be alive, right? And even though that glue, that glob of glue, looked like it was moving and doing everything that a living thing could do, it was missing those three key components, right? It wasn't growing, it wasn't using any energy, and it wasn't making any more of itself. All right, so looks can be deceiving, but an organism or a living thing must be able to do those things. Okay, so where do we put living things or organisms? All right, we put them in a habitat. All right, and a habitat is just an environment, right? A place, right? Which provides what an organism needs to survive. The living parts of a habitat are called the biotic factors. I think biology is the study of life. So, biotic factors, right, are living parts of a habitat. Now, in science, we use a lot of Latin words and a lot of Latin terminologies, and when we put the letter A in front of some words, it means the opposite of what we're talking about, or to be non-something. So an abiotic factor would be a non-living part of a habitat. All right. So biotic factors include things like animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, but abiotic factors include things like wind, air, minerals, sunlight, water, right? Things that are not living but contribute to helping an organism live in its environment. Right? We also have levels of organization for ecology. All right, we'll start with the largest and we'll work our way down to the smallest. There's also a small group mini lesson about levels of organization in ecology. Right, but we live on Earth. The Earth contains all of the different levels of organization. It's the biggest level. All right, when we get down into smaller sections of the Earth, or the biosphere, we end up with these things called biomes. All right, we have lots of different kinds of biomes. We have water biomes, we have land biomes, and we're going to talk about those in our next activity list, right? But you're familiar with some of them, like rainforests and boreal forests and deserts. Right? All of these things are basically places with specific climates, right, and specific weather that happen there, which make certain organisms grow better there as opposed to others. So we start again with the biosphere, the whole Earth. And then we have several different biomes. Some people think there are 7, some people think there are 9, some people think there's 14. None of it really matters, right? We can talk about just different areas where different living and non-living things are more likely to be found. Okay, specifically within a biome, we have an ecosystem. And you can see in this diagram here that we're looking at an ecosystem that is forested, could be kind of cold, But it contains the living and non-living things that are going on in a biome. So you'll see the water over here. You'll see mountains up here. All right, but you'll also see living things like there's an eagle and a bear, right, and some trees. Those are the biotic factors in this ecosystem. Okay? Then we come down to a smaller level of our organization where we have all of the living things. Right? A community. Right? These are the different species of living organisms in an ecosystem, right? Which is part of a biome, which is part of the entire Earth. Right? Looking even closer down, we now have a population, right? Which are all of the same type of organism in one area. Right? So these are all of the different, they look like caribou or some kind of elk. All right. Then we look at an individual, which we can also call an organism. All right. So working our way from a single organism to all of the organisms in an area, and then all of the different kinds of organisms in this particular area, all the different populations of living things, to living and non-living things in an area, to all of the different areas on Earth that are different from one another, to the entire Earth. Those are the levels of organizations. Okay, when we're talking about different populations in particular, all right, populations are the total number of a particular organism in a community. Right. So if you're talking about a desert population with the desert biome, you would be looking at the total number of snakes or the total number of cacti. All right, that would be a population. In order for us to figure out just how many organisms are in a population, we have to be able to understand what size we're dealing with to begin with, and then think about the best method. So we could take a particular small group and just count them, right, through direct observation. Right? But sometimes we can't find all of the organisms in a population, so we have to use some indirect methods. All right, such as taking a look at nests or holes that are dug to determine just how many organisms we can't see. Or if we're dealing with a rather large population of organisms, right, we take a small number of those organisms in a small area, right, and we estimate the total number based on the total community size. Right? And there are some reasons why we might end up having some population changes. Right? They grow, they shrink. Having a birth rate change would increase the population or decrease the population. Having a death rate change would increase or decrease the population. And then having immigration occur, having some members of a different group come into that population, immigration, right, would change the population size. And when we're talking about overall communities or ecosystems, sometimes we have entire populations that come into one of those ecosystems that don't belong there, and we call those invasive species. There is going to be an activity on your activity list where you could read an article about the pythons invading the Everglades in Florida, and how they're basically taking over the entire ecosystem because they don't have any natural predators to stop them from just eating anything and everything they want. Right, we have other organisms like the lionfish, which is another activity that you'll see. Zebra mussels, which are a problem locally in the Hudson River. Somebody had a boat somewhere where zebra mussels were native. Those mussels attached to that person's boat. That boat ended up back in the Hudson River after a trip, and the zebra mussels found a nice cozy home in the Hudson River as a result of that, because they had no natural competition, and we're able to just use up the resources in our ecosystems. It's having a big effect on native fish populations. So these organisms typically have no competition or natural enemies, all right? And they can get any resources they need, and they reproduce fast and disrupt entire ecosystems. Okay. We can also have organisms not only enter an ecosystem, but they can leave. So the opposite of immigration is emigration, right? And we also have a limit to just how many organisms can be in an ecosystem, right? So aside from birth rate and death rate and organisms coming and going, or what kind of competition there is, we also have something called carrying capacity. Right? And capacity is just the limit or number of things that can be in a space. And carrying capacity or carrying is just how many those organisms, basically the resources available to those organisms, and how much the ecosystem can handle that. We have a really great example here of the kaibab deer population, and you'll see there's a lab on your activity list about that. The reason why the kaibab deer population is a great example of carrying capacity is because that during the early part of the 20th century, they were studied in an area where they were able to roam free, and they had no natural predators and unlimited resources. And then as time went on, their population exploded. So you end up seeing all of these deer, and this is in thousands. You see thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of deer. The population grows and grows and grows. But then there were warning signs, and ecologists were able to study some of these warning signs. Right? You'll start to see some of the deer starving, and then a lot of the area becoming limited, and then the resources becoming limited. And then there was a huge spike in the population and a massive drop in the population because of some winters that were particularly harsh. And over half of the herd starved as a result of the limited resources and space and the harsh conditions. And so what happened was, over time, this population kept dropping off and then found an eventual equilibrium, which is a word that we've used before, right? Where we've talked about direct relationships with graphs and indirect relationships with graphs, right? And then this dynamic equilibrium. So carrying capacity is a great example of an eventual dynamic equilibrium, where this red line, right, represents the best number of deer, the kaibab deer, that could live in the ecosystem provided without using up all the resources and helping have a sustained healthy population. So they found this K number, this carrying capacity, to be somewhere around 30,000. All right, and over time, that population has stabilized to around that number, and it is a great case study of the idea that ecosystems are limited, all right, by resources, by space, and by any number of other things, from predators to other abiotic factors, some predictable or unpredictable, as the case of these harsh winters. So carrying capacity is something that can affect the size of a population.